"That bum steals from you every night," yelled the beggar girl, pointing at the millionaire's cleaning lady. The millionaire was furious at the accusation the beggar girl made towards his trusted employee, whom he greatly confided in. But when the security cameras are checked, what appears makes everything change. The scream that sliced through the silence of that hot afternoon echoed through the narrow streets of the historic town like a blade through thin silk. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity that made the neighbors close their windows and pretend not to hear. The 52-year-old businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxurious apartment, located on the top floor of the only modern building on that street of preserved colonial buildings. For 3 consecutive weeks, that sound had been coming from the 2-story yellow house with peeling blue window frames across the street. The colonial construction contrasted sharply with the modern elegance of where he lived. A spacious apartment decorated with Italian designer furniture and contemporary artwork that reflected the wealth accumulated through decades of building one of the largest construction companies in the region. As the owner of a construction company that handled millions in annual contracts, the millionaire was accustomed to solving complex problems involving large investments and delicate negotiations. His assets included not only the family business, but also a diversified portfolio of stocks on the stock market, investments in real estate, investment trusts, and even a small amount in Bitcoin that he had bought out of curiosity 2 years before. However, when it came to the human dramas that took place on the other side of his window, he preferred to maintain the emotional distance he had cultivated since losing his wife 5 years earlier. The loss of his companion on a rainy night that he avoided remembering had transformed the prosperous businessman into a reclusive man who found refuge only in work and the numbers that appeared on his bank statements. His monthly dividends were automatically deposited. His profits reinvested without emotion. His passive income grew while he withered emotionally inside an apartment that seemed more like a museum of his former life. Across the street, inside the colonial house that exuded an air of poorly disguised decay, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen. Her large dark eyes reflected a fear that no child should know, as she watched her 38-year-old aunt firmly hold a metal spoon that she had heated on the electric stove. The woman's red eyes, blurred by the alcohol she had been consuming since noon, stared at her niece with a rage that seemed to grow each day. The aunt had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by the addiction she developed after taking custody of the orphaned girl. Now she survived on a small pension and government assistance that she received for the child, amounts that barely covered her basic needs, let alone her destructive desires for cheap whiskey bought at the corner liquor store. The heated spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving another red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her delicate skin. The child bit her lower lip to avoid screaming louder, as she had learned through painful experiences that screams only angered her aunt more, who interpreted any sound as a challenge to her distorted authority. Closing her eyes tightly, the girl tried to remember the soft voice of her mother, singing that special lullaby before bed. It was all that remained of her now, precious fragments of memories and a song that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most terrible moments, like an invisible hug that consoled her when the pain became unbearable. The aunt put the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world, her mechanical movements revealing that this routine of cruelty had become part of her daily life. Her mind, dulled by alcohol, did not fully process the monstrosity of her actions, only the distorted satisfaction of exercising power over someone even more vulnerable than she. The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space that smelled of mold and contained only an old bed with torn sheets and a crucifix on the peeling wall. There she curled up in the thin fabric that served as a blanket and began to hum softly her mother's song, the only thing that still managed to calm her fear-fueled racing heart. What she didn't know was that, across the street, someone had finally paid real attention to that melody that escaped through the half-open window. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts on his desk when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His late wife used to hum it while cooking, a popular tune about free birds flying through limitless skies. He approached the window again, his eyes carefully scanning the deteriorated facade of the colonial house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that tremulous but persistent childish voice, laden with a sadness that touched something deep in his grief-hardened chest. For the first time in 3 weeks of intermittent screams, the millionaire felt something other than the simple annoyance that made him close the curtains. There was something in that small voice that awakened a responsibility long buried beneath thick layers of obsessive work and self-imposed emotional isolation, something that reminded him of human connections that he had deliberately cut off to protect himself from further loss. In the house next to the colonial construction, a 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the child's melancholic song. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the disturbing signs coming from that residence. During her 40 years teaching in elementary school, she had developed a keen instinct for recognizing children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her experienced heart clench with anguish. The melody had stopped abruptly, but something in those few minutes had planted a seed of unease that would grow until it became action. The businessman remained at the window longer than usual, an uncomfortable feeling expanding in his chest as repressed memories began to emerge like bubbles rising to the surface of deep waters. The next morning brought with it the familiar aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the historic town, awakening for another day of tourist routine. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with special care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't let her sleep peacefully, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years dedicated to the education of vulnerable children. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the yellowed colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling, heavy steps slowly approached. The girl's aunt opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the devastating effects of the previous night's binge. Her breath carried the sour smell of alcohol mixed with personal neglect. The teacher offered her most gentle and diplomatic smile, the same one she had used for decades to deal with troublesome parents in difficult school meetings. She had brought a tray of homemade cookies as a pretext for the visit, a strategy she had learned was effective in breaking down barriers of distrust in delicate situations. The woman hesitated visibly, running her hands through her disheveled hair and trying to mentally organize a plausible excuse. The house was a complete mess, with empty bottles scattered around the room, and a smell of mold that denounced the lack of basic care for the environment where a child should grow up healthy and protected. When the teacher mentioned her desire to get to know her niece better, the aunt's face hardened for a revealing moment before forcing a yellow and artificial smile. She quickly invented that the girl was sick with a high fever, and that it would be better not to approach to avoid contagion. Her voice trembled slightly as she lied, revealing nervousness that an experienced educator could easily detect. At that crucial moment, a soft but distinctive noise came from the direction of the kitchen, the unmistakable sound of something being dragged on the old wooden floor. The teacher sharpened her trained ears, immediately recognizing the movement pattern of a child, trying to move silently so as not to be discovered, probably trying to reach something essential like water or food. The aunt blocked the entrance more determinedly with her body, but her nervous hands and the way she avoided direct eye contact confirmed all the suspicions that had been growing in the visitor's experienced mind. The strong smell of alcohol emanating from her, even though it was still early in the morning, completed a disturbing picture that the teacher knew well from the social worker reports she had read during her career. Across the street, the businessman watched the entire interaction from his panoramic window while drinking his imported coffee in a fine porcelain cup. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams, where the childish voice he had heard the previous afternoon mixed with painful memories of his late wife humming around the house that now seemed like a mausoleum of memories. When he saw the teacher at the door of the colonial house, a strange and inexplicable curiosity invaded him. He knew the woman by sight. He always saw her tending the garden with meticulous dedication, politely greeting the neighbors, walking in the morning with the erect posture of someone who had spent decades transmitting knowledge. There was something in her presence at that door that suggested purpose beyond a simple social visit of courtesy. The teacher finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not without casting an investigative and penetrating look into the dark interior of the house. Her 4 decades of experience dealing with troubled families had taught her to read between the lines, to perceive signs that ordinary people would ignore. There was something deeply wrong in that residence, and every instinct developed throughout her career screamed that a child was suffering inside. As she walked back to her own house, the teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She couldn't simply ignore what she had observed and felt. She needed to find a discreet but effective way to verify her growing suspicions, even if it meant getting involved in a delicate situation that could have unpredictable consequences. Inside the colonial house, the aunt locked the door with excessive force and went to the kitchen with heavy steps that echoed her growing irritation. She found the girl crouched behind the old wooden table, trying to hide like a small, cornered animal. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the high sink, but her small stature did not allow it, and she had knocked over a wooden chair in the process, creating the noise that almost betrayed her presence. The aunt exploded in disproportionate fury, her irritation intensified by the pounding hangover and the unexpected visit that had awakened paranoia about curious neighbors asking inconvenient questions. Her mind, dulled by alcohol, interpreted the child's natural thirst as a deliberate challenge to her orders to remain quiet and invisible. The girl whispered in her tiny voice that she was just thirsty, but even this innocent explanation was interpreted as insolence by the woman who had completely lost control over her own emotions and behaviors. The response was immediate and cruel. The child would be expelled to the small backyard as punishment, where she should remain under the strong midday sun until the aunt decided when she could return. The backyard was a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree that offered partial shade. There, the girl sat on the dry earth and began to draw with a piece of charcoal that she had found near the abandoned wood stove. There were always birds in her creations. Small, large, some flying with open wings, others perched on imaginary branches that she drew with careful strokes. Each charcoal stroke on the earth represented her impossible dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. In her 4-year-old mind, the birds she drew possessed the magical ability to escape from anywhere, to find open skies where no one could hurt them. The hours passed slowly under the intense heat. The aunt had deliberately locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard without access to water or adequate protection from the inclement sun. The child began to feel dizzy and intensely thirsty, but she knew from bitter experience that knocking on the door would only result in more severe and prolonged punishment. It was then that she began to sing softly her mother's lullaby, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have completely forgotten that she existed. Her weak but persistent voice carried all the accumulated sadness of a stolen childhood, echoing through the yard like a silent prayer for salvation. This familiar melody reached the attentive ears of the businessman again. This time, he could not ignore or rationalize what he was hearing. There was something hauntingly familiar in that voice, in that specific song that his wife used to sing. He picked up his cell phone with slightly trembling hands and, almost without consciously thinking, began to record the audio that floated through the hot afternoon. He didn't understand exactly why he felt the need to document that moment, but a deep instinct told him that he might need that evidence in the future. As he recorded, fragments of repressed memories began to fit together in his mind, like pieces of a complex puzzle that he had avoided assembling during years of self-imposed mourning. 3 days had passed since the businessman began to document the episodes of suffering that came from the colonial house, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire that grew with each passing hour. During that time, he had systematically recorded the sporadic screams that echoed always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality that made his stomach churn with disgust and repressed indignation. His collection of videos and audios grew on his cell phone, as evidence of a disturbing reality that he still didn't have the courage to confront directly. The emotional paralysis that had dominated him since the loss of his wife had transformed into something even more toxic, the cowardice of a wealthy man who observed child suffering from his comfortable window without taking concrete action to stop it. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a courageous decision that would definitely change the course of events. She had spent 3 consecutive nights awake, tormented by the growing certainty that a child was being systematically mistreated just a few feet from her house, while she remained a passive spectator of a tragedy that unfolded in slow motion. She decided to approach the situation more strategically and calculatedly. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the girl's aunt, which would obviously result in more lies and evasions, she opted for a systematic observation approach that her experience as an educator had taught her was more effective in cases of family neglect. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself discreetly in the side yard of her house, the strategic location from where she had the best view of the backyard of the colonial house. She had prepared a plausible excuse if she was questioned. She was simply tending to her morning plants, a routine activity that no one would find suspicious or intrusive. What she saw left her completely horrified and confirmed her worst fears. The girl was sitting alone under the mango tree, wearing only a torn t-shirt and dirty underwear. Her small, thin arms were visibly marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed, others already scarred in shapes that denoted systematic repetition of violence. The child was drawing in the dry earth with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher immediately recognized as birds. There were dozens of them scattered across the ground around the girl, some erased by the previous night's rain, others fresh and detailed with the meticulous care that only a child desperate for escapism can apply to her creations. The girl raised her large, dark eyes when she realized she was being watched. For a tense moment, the two stared at each other in silence through the fence that separated the yards. Then, to the teacher's moving surprise, the child smiled, a weak and hesitant but genuine smile, and waved timidly with her little earth-stained hand. The teacher responded to the greeting with a warm wave, struggling to keep her voice steady as she spoke to the girl through the fence. The child affectionately called her Grandma, using the respectful address she had learned to give to all elderly ladies, demonstrating politeness that contrasted sharply with the environment of neglect where she was being raised. When asked if the girl was okay, the answer came accompanied by a quick and fearful glance towards the windows of the house, a gesture that spoke more than any verbal explanation. The child said she was just drawing little birds, and when questioned about this preference, her answer broke the teacher's heart. She liked birds because they could fly wherever they wanted. At that crucial moment, the aunt's rough and drunken voice echoed from inside the house, calling for the girl with a tone that mixed irritation and threat. The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know about the nature of her relationship with her legal guardian. The girl quickly stood up, wiped her dirty hands on her torn t-shirt, and ran inside the house, but not before looking once more at the teacher with an expression that silently screamed for help. Her large eyes carried a desperate plea that transcended words, a direct appeal from a small soul to someone who finally seemed to see her as a person worthy of protection. The teacher remained in her yard for a few more minutes, carefully processing what she had witnessed. The burns, the visceral fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything definitely confirmed her worst fears about what was happening in that deteriorated house. She could no longer feign ignorance or hope that the situation would magically resolve itself. She had a moral responsibility to act, even if it meant getting involved in a complex situation that could have unpredictable legal and personal ramifications for everyone involved. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction through his panoramic window. Through the magnifying lenses, he used to observe details of works from a distance. He managed to partially see the backyard of the colonial house, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him physically sick. For the first time in 5 years of self-imposed mourning, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest, an anger that was not directed at himself or the cruel fate that had taken his wife, but at an adult who deliberately caused suffering to a defenseless child. It was a purifying emotion that cut through his chronic depression like a hot knife. In that moment of emotional clarity, a repressed memory emerged with devastating force. He remembered a kind employee who had worked in his construction company years ago, a sweet, smiling woman who always hummed while organizing files and papers. She had abruptly left the company, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. The employee used to speak affectionately about her little daughter, a 4-year-old girl whose name he now struggled to remember. And she hummed. She hummed exactly the same song that he had heard coming from the colonial house. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach, leaving him breathless for several seconds. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing from his life. How had he been so blind and absorbed in his own problems as not to make this obvious connection? How had he failed so completely to realize that someone from his own professional circle was facing difficulties that led her to leave her daughter in a dangerous situation? The guilt that already consumed him multiplied exponentially, now including the bitter regret for not having paid adequate attention to the signs that his employee might be needing help. His investments in stocks had grown, his profits accumulated automatically in accounts that he rarely checked. His wealth increased, while a child connected to him through past professional ties suffered systematic violence. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a final decision that could not be reversed. She put on her best business attire, picked up a new tray of homemade cookies as a pretext, and headed once more to the colonial house. This time, there was a determination in her steps that did not exist in her previous visit. The aunt answered the door with even greater reluctance, clearly irritated by the insistence of the meddling neighbor. But the teacher was no longer willing to accept polite evasions. She used all the authority that decades of classroom had given her, entering the house before the drunken woman could effectively protest. The interior of the colonial house was even worse than she had imagined. It smelled of mold, mixed with cheap alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied poorly lit spaces, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. It was the environment of a person who had completely given up on maintaining appearances or basic care. When the teacher insisted on meeting the girl, the aunt lied again about the child being asleep. But her nervous eyes and the way she physically blocked the path to the back of the house revealed anxiety that confirmed all suspicions. At that crucial moment, a low but unmistakable sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible, but which cut through the tense silence like an involuntary confession. The teacher and the aunt froze simultaneously, both understanding the meaning of that noise that denounced the child's presence exactly where the woman claimed she was not. The silence that followed was loaded with tension and non-verbal revelations. The aunt tried to quickly disguise, claiming it must be the neighbor's cat, but her voice trembled in a way that made it clear to the experienced teacher that she was lying desperately. The woman knew she had been discovered in her neglect, and panic began to take over her drunken features. The teacher smiled politely and nodded, pretending to accept the implausible explanation, but had decided that she had already seen enough evidence to confirm her worst suspicions. She said goodbye in a seemingly cordial way, but made it clear, through her carefully modulated tone, that it was not just an offer of casual help. It was a subtle but direct warning that she was watching and that she knew exactly what was happening in that house. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door with excessive force and went to the kitchen with heavy steps that echoed her growing fury. She found the girl exactly where she suspected, huddled behind the old wood stove, trying to hide like a small and terrified animal. The child had cried silently when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, vaguely remembering the kindness she had once known when her mother was still alive. The aunt exploded in furious accusations, blaming the girl for making noise and attracting unwanted attention from the neighbors. Her drunken paranoia interpreted the teacher's natural curiosity as a conspiracy against her, and all her anger was directed at the helpless child whom she considered responsible for her growing problems. The girl tried to defend herself with her tiny voice, explaining that she had not made noise intentionally, but even this innocent attempt to justify herself was interpreted as insolence by the woman who had completely lost control over her destructive emotions. Her eyes shone with the familiar fury that the child had learned to fear more than anything else in the world. The aunt took the metal spoon that she always kept close to the stove and placed it directly in the high flame. The girl immediately recognized the terrible ritual and began to tremble uncontrollably, knowing exactly what would come next. She had experienced that pain so many times that her body reacted instinctively to seeing the preparations for another session of systematic torture. Across the street, the businessman had strategically positioned his cell phone in the window and was recording again. This time he managed to capture not only the terrifying sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window of the colonial house. What he saw through the small screen of the device made him physically sick and made him make an irreversible decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer of a tragedy that unfolded before his eyes. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated woman who always spoke of her daughter with unconditional love. That child had become his responsibility through connections that he had ignored for years, whether he wanted to accept this moral burden or not. As the girl suffered another episode of meticulous violence, the businessman made a phone call that he had not made for months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, a competent man who handled complex legal matters involving his construction company and his diverse investments. He explained the delicate situation with a tense voice, describing evidence of child abuse that he had documented and his personal connection to the family through his former employee. The lawyer listened attentively, immediately understanding the legal and moral gravity of the situation that his client was describing with disturbing details. The professional arrived at the businessman's apartment the next morning with a grave expression that reflected the seriousness of the situation. During their years of friendship, he knew well the emotional isolation that his client had built after the traumatic loss of his wife, making it even more significant that the man was voluntarily getting involved in such a complex and emotionally charged issue. They examined together the disturbing recordings that the businessman had collected over the previous days. As a lawyer specializing in family law, the professional had dealt with many cases of child abuse during his career, but something in the systematization of that documented violence disturbed him deeply, especially considering the extremely vulnerable age of the victim. The lawyer explained that such compelling evidence required immediate action through the appropriate legal channels. They contacted the competent authorities, who initiated an urgent investigation based on the recordings and the detailed testimony that both men provided about the pattern of systematic abuse they had observed and documented. The official intervention took place on a sunny afternoon when a team of specialized social workers arrived at the colonial house, accompanied by legal representatives. The teacher, who had made her own independent report based on her observations, offered to accompany the team using her experience with traumatized children. When they finally found the girl locked in the stuffy room at the back, softly singing her sad song to console herself, everyone present felt a painful squeeze in their heart. The child raised her large and frightened eyes, not initially understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her, but recognizing the gentle teacher who had shown kindness through the backyard fence. The removal of the girl from that house of suffering was a moment that would be engraved in the memory of all those involved. She held tightly to the teacher's hand, her small and hesitant steps as she crossed the door that had been her prison for so many months of silent agony. The aunt was confronted about her acts of neglect and systematic violence, admitting amidst tears of shame and panic that she had lost control due to alcohol and resentments that she herself could not rationally explain. She faced appropriate legal consequences for her crimes against a defenseless child. The businessman, moved by genuine gratitude and recognition that a vulnerable child and a courageous woman had taken real risks to expose the situation, offered practical support to ensure that the girl had access to medical care, proper education, and a safe environment where she could finally begin to recover from the traumas suffered. The teacher, who had demonstrated exceptional courage by actively engaging in the protection of a child she didn't even know personally, became a maternal figure in the girl's life, offering emotional stability and affection that had been brutally denied during months of suffering. 18 months later, on a peaceful Saturday afternoon, the girl celebrated her 6th birthday in a completely transformed environment. Surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being, she smiled in a way that radiated the natural joy that every child deserves to experience. Her drawings now included not only birds flying free, but also colorful houses, vibrant flowers, and happy people holding hands. The businessman had learned through this transformative experience that his accumulated wealth, his investments in stocks, his dividend profits, his investments in diverse funds, had true meaning only when used to create real positive impact in the lives of people who needed protection and opportunities. The girl no longer needed to dream only of free birds, for she had discovered that there are people willing to protect vulnerable children, that human kindness can triumph over cruelty, and that even in the most desperate situations, there is always hope that someone courageous will make the right decision to act when witnessing injustice against the most defenseless in society. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.